The title for this afternoon's session is Coming Together Along the Food Chain, Opportunities for Enhanced Collaboration. Coming together for animal agriculture means coming together with everyone involved in the process of getting meat, poultry, dairy, and eggs from farm to fork, including our restaurant, retail, and food service partners. This afternoon's session will dive into the challenges faced by brands along the supply chain and how the animal agriculture community can effectively engage and be a resource. Today's speakers are Dr. Karen Christensen, Senior Director, Animal Wellbeing at Tyson Foods, Banks Baker, Director of New Product Marketing at Genus PIC, and Dallas Hockman, Vice President, Industry Relations at National Pork Producers Council. And you can find full biographies for all of our speakers, again, in the Summit app. Before I turn things over to today's panelists, I'd like to get your opinion on a poll question. What do you believe has the most influence on restaurant, retail, and food service decisions regarding animal protein sourcing policies? Is it consumer purchasing trends, inquiries from consumers, investor pressure, activist organization pressure, regulations or legislation, or something else? And if you think it's something else that's not listed, make sure you tell us in the chat. So more than half of you believe that it's consumer purchasing trends that has the most influence on restaurant, retail, food service decisions regarding animal protein sourcing policies. And secondly, followed by pressure from activist or extremist organizations. But every one of our options there got at least one vote. And some folks had some other ideas that maybe they can fill us in on the chat. So thanks everyone for participating in the poll. With that, again, I'm really excited to hear the insights from this afternoon's speakers. Please do get your questions typed into the Q&A box, and we will get to all of those after all three panelists have spoken. And I will invite Karen up to the virtual stage to get us started. Thank you.
Thank you, Hannah, and I appreciate the opportunity to participate in the webinar today, talking about this important topic. So I would like to direct my comments today along this idea of coming together along the food chain, opportunities for enhanced collaboration, to talk about where some of the pressure to assure animal welfare is coming from, and how we can, how we can leverage that to drive continuous improvement. And I think today we're going to start with consumers. I think all of us know that consumers are more interested, but at the same time, less connected to where their food comes from than ever before. And so I think that as they continue to ask great questions about how the animals that end up on their plate are raised, we owe it to them to engage in those important conversations. You know, I'm not sure that consumers really want to know the details about maybe space or breed or other types of the details that we worry about every single day. But I think that consumers really want to know that their values are represented in the values of the food company or the finished products that they are purchasing and engaged with. I think that right now, with the supply chain issues that everybody's familiar with, that availability and cost and uncertainty is making this conversation even more difficult. As was reflected on the poll, I think there are some pressure, obviously being exerted by the NGOs. And I think that they're using the customer interest in where their food comes from to drive their agenda, not only about welfare, but I think ultimately on removing animal protein from the center of the plate. So unfortunately, the pressure here isn't going to stop as we continue to drive continuous improvement in welfare, but it's going to continue to be pushed until the agenda of removing all of that animal protein is there. And unfortunately, I don't think that that is going to lead to what everyone's concerned about is really improving the animal welfare of the animals in our supply chain. And I think we all agree that there's more than one path to good animal welfare. And I think it's important that consumers and customers get better educated in these important conversations about what animal welfare and what good animal welfare really looks like. I think the other thing that's really important for all of us to understand is that welfare is not an isolated issue. We really have to take a holistic approach to this very complicated subject, because there are so many other issues that cannot be separated from animal welfare. And what I'm talking about are things like sustainability. When we talk about sustainability, we can include environmental impacts. We can talk about food insecurity. We can talk about food availability, and of course, affordability. So I think that all of those things have to be considered when we're making these decisions that are likely to have impacts on the supply chain. Now, I also want to be very clear that I'm not suggesting that animal welfare is compromised as we take a holistic approach. I think that what I really want to focus on is the fact that we have to win in all of those areas. And that's going to take a lot of creative efforts, a lot of research, and a lot of knowledge to make sure that we truly are winning in the welfare front, winning in the environmental front, and winning in the food availability and food insecurity front. So we have a much more difficult road ahead of us than just focusing on one particular issue. But I think that the path to good animal welfare is definitely achievable. I think we have an opportunity to educate customers, consumers, and stakeholders on what better welfare can look like. And I think it's one suggestion, I think, is that we start to focus on key welfare indicators. So what are key welfare indicators? Well, let's focus on the outcomes that we can measure and that we can manage that provides customers and consumers with the assurance that the animals under our care truly led a good life. So if we talk about just on the poultry side, what types of key welfare indicators could we be thinking about that would help drive this message and assure people that are operating in the food supply chain that those animals came from a situation that met their expectations and met the expectations of consumers? And that's a terrific story to be able to tell. So I've listed some examples of key welfare indicators that I'm sure everybody will recognize. Things like PAW scores, which gives us a great indication of the environment that the animals were raised in. Wing damage and transportation livability tells us a lot about human-animal interaction and that important transportation piece. And then cull verification, I think, is also important to make sure that any animal that isn't going to thrive in its environment is immediately taken care of properly and humanely. And then we also can think about environmental impacts, like measuring, measuring litter quality, air quality, and making sure that those basic requirements of the animals are met and documented, and that we can share that with people in the supply chain as we begin to gain trust with both customers and consumers. As a matter of fact, we are starting to see more of an interest in key welfare indicators. Customers are starting to talk about indicators that they would like to have reported to them on a regular basis, and I'm excited to see that move. The International Poultry Welfare Alliance, which many of the listeners today may be a member of, will very shortly be releasing a guidance document on key welfare indicators for all of the poultry species, so turkeys, layers, and broilers. This is going to be a much needed and very detailed document discussing the key welfare indicators in every life stage of the different poultry species. I'm excited to be a part of that, and I'm excited to see how this document can be used in collaboration with customers and producers again, to drive continuous improvement in animal welfare. And then the National Chicken Council is currently revising their broiler and broiler breeder audits. And I think that when those new documents are released, we'll also see a new push towards focusing on these key welfare indicators. So this is one of the ways that I think that we can demonstrate that there are multiple paths forward in order to assure good welfare and to satisfy the questions of both the consumers and customers. And also just a couple of comments about customers and how they can use the information that they have to share their goals and expectations for animal welfare within their supply chain. So I think that there's a great opportunity there for customers to help their customers understand what welfare really means to them. I think that they need to share their expectation about welfare and the supply chain that provides them with their products. And their website is going to be a great source of information to talk about welfare and provide information that relates to sharing the fact that their goals about animal care really are in line with their customers. And I think the customers are going to have to become more educated in these important decisions about animal welfare. What's the impact of some of these decisions? What does good welfare look like? And I think that they'll take the opportunity to be knowledgeable about these concepts will help them to make good decisions regarding supply chain opportunities. And then I think we need to share positive messages about what they consider good welfare to look like. There's a lot of work that still needs to be done, but making sure that the ultimate consumer understands that the values of the food companies, the producers, the restaurants, the grocery stores, all facets of the supply chain hold those same values about animal care is really important. And I think it's also very important that we all together focus on continuous improvement in animal welfare. And with that, I'll turn it over to Banks.
Well, I just want to start off by thanking the Animal Ag Alliance, Kay and Hannah, for having me today. It's great to be here and on this esteemed panel. My name is Banks Baker. I'm Director of New Product Marketing for PIC, which is the Pig Improvement Company. And PIC is a global animal genetics and biotechnology company. And you may be familiar with PIC, but also potentially our sister company, ABS, who also provides beef and dairy genetics. But of course, I've worked with many of you on the line and here today over the last 5 years while I was at McDonald's, and I was focused on protein sustainability. So I'm really excited to say that today, this is my first presentation in my new role. So it's great to be connected back with you all again. Hannah asked me to speak about some of the pressures that food service and retail companies receive and how they're being addressed. So while I'm happy to do that, I would also just like to provide the disclaimer that I'm speaking through my past experiences and I'm no longer representing a restaurant or a food service brand. So, with that caveat, I'm excited to dive in. I'm going to provide an overview of some of the issues and the ways that downstream companies receive and react to pressure, and also share some of the great collaborative work that's happening across the industry. And where I could, I tried to use some recent news stories and headlines to kind of reaffirm my point. And so as I dive in here, it was a brief presentation, so it's not meant to be all encompassing, just some really interesting things that I think are of note for the progress that we're all trying to drive together. So I'm going to start here. I didn't mean to start off negative, but I think when most people think about the pressures that food brands face, they often think of the direct outside the office protests. And I think that's for good reason as well. These types of pressures, they often receive pretty strong press coverage, and they can be visually striking or appalling. Some of the protests seem to be more subdued with more direct messaging, but oftentimes, and really increasingly so, I'm starting to see more protest messaging that's overly simplified and negative, and it aligns typically with some type of external activist organizational campaign. Companies receive a lot of pressure, but heated topics of interest seem currently to center around livestock production, protein sales, and climate change. And I think that really goes to the message in the world that we live in with social media and the way that we interact. It really seems like it's easier to create outrage than it is to inspire positivity and change. So I wanted to highlight some of these things here. The picture on the right, this was actually here while I was at McDonald's, of the angry Ronald McDonald. That was the result of McDonald's not signing up to, and I'm doing the quotations here, the Better Chicken Commitment, which I'm sure a lot of you on the line are familiar with. But this campaign didn't just stop outside of our restaurant with pretty terrible visuals that way. They also included roving billboards that had pictures of mutilated birds that weren't even in a McDonald's supply chain. It also included custom websites that utilized the names of company leadership and board members, claiming that they are animal abusers. And so, it gets very, very personal. And I think a lot of times we've heard, from our colleagues that are at some of those companies, and when it gets that personal level, sometimes leadership and board, they feel that and they'd like to make that go away. And I think sometimes we've seen that drive the adoption of some of these commitments that may or may not be delivering the outcome that as an industry we're all driven towards. This picture on the bottom left there is an interesting one. Protesters, they erected a bamboo tower and they blockaded a McDonald's distribution center in the EU. And they did that for, I believe it was actually a couple of days. And it's kind of, the bamboo structures are kind of impressive, actually, the way that they were able to build them up. But they blockaded an entire beef plant and it did affect operations. And they were demanding that McDonald's as a company worldwide become plant-based and remove all animal proteins by 2025. And so these type of things, they do happen and they become in the press. You can still search them. And I think sometimes that does have a very strong consumer effect. But we're also seeing pressure being applied in other ways. Investors and shareholders are also asking questions about animal welfare and sustainability. And the one that I hear, and I've actually heard it on these previous webcasts leading up to the summit, the biggest example is likely Larry Fink, who's the outspoken leader of BlackRock. And BlackRock has over $10 trillion in investments in their portfolio, and they're using that investment to drive for sustainability change. And they're specifically and especially focusing on climate change across many different sectors. And that's a pretty significant thing. That's a $10 trillion company investment portfolio that's driving for sustainability within a company. I knew that I would have to touch on, even if briefly, the Carl Icahn shareholder proposal, which is getting quite a bit of attention right now. Carl Icahn does have an open shareholder proposal with McDonald's about sow housing and pig welfare, and it's getting a lot of attention. Mr. Icahn proposed appointing 2 members to McDonald's board. One of those appointees, Leslie Samuel Rich, and she's from Green Century Capital Management. She said that if she's elected, she would push for McDonald's to tackle other sustainability issues like lowering the environmental impact of farming and lessening antibiotic use. And so I think the message is clear there that although the reason for the board appointee from Carl Icahn's perspective was around animal welfare, the appointee is interested in addressing a variety of other sustainability issues. So not just focusing on sow housing. Shareholder pressure isn't just about meeting an external demand. These investors are engaging because they're concerned with the long-term viability of businesses that a warming climate faces. And so you may have also seen Costco currently has an open and outstanding shareholder proposal regarding setting climate action targets themselves. And there was an interesting fact in an article that I was reading that I wanted to share with you all. And this is pretty striking. Support for shareholder proposals on greenhouse gas emissions rose to an average of around 59% last year, and compared to 25% in 2017. That's according to the nonprofit, the Sustainable Investment Institute. And so I'll just say that again, because I think it's pretty striking, is that shareholder proposals have been supported 59% as compared to 25% last year, as compared to 25% in 2017. And so this is heating up and it's getting traction, not just with the investors, but with the shareholders themselves and voting in support. But companies and corporations are responding, and they're being very productive. The Science-Based Target Initiative, or SBTI, it's become the de facto standard for setting corporate climate action goals. Companies work with SBTI to create and register their climate reduction targets that align with the Paris Climate Accord, keeping global warming within 1.5 degrees Celsius. And so with this effort, we've seen over 1,000 companies in 50 sectors that are working with the SBTI to set science-based targets. And of course, included in that are some of the largest food brands and agricultural companies in the world. But we're also seeing a lot of movement on the government side. The federal government and the Biden administration have also set climate goals, committing to be net zero by 2050. You may have also seen the Securities Exchange Commission, the SEC, is exploring requiring all publicly traded companies to disclose their emissions, which would be pretty significant. And so, as we look at this, one of the questions that keeps coming up amongst the conversations that I've had is, we're all kind of left wondering, now that there is a stated target and a pending emissions reporting requirement, could there be additional federal regulation or tax or other types of incentives or means to reduce emissions that come from the government level that don't make it voluntary, like an SBTI? I think that's something that we're all keeping an eye on. So we've also seen the protein industry respond, really, in my opinion, in an impressive way, in supporting the climate goals that we're seeing being made upstream. And they're making climate targets and setting ambitions of their own that support the food service and retail companies. The pork industry committed to reducing greenhouse gas emissions by 40%. The beef industry committed to becoming carbon neutral by 2040. And the US dairy industry committed to becoming carbon neutral by 2050. And this is a really significant movement, and we're seeing some great progress here. And as we talk about collaboration, it's going to happen across the entire value chain. And having industry commitments like this, I think, are going to be very supportive. So we're also seeing other external organizations whose efforts support value chain climate ambitions as well. And so I just wanted to highlight a few of those. The U.S. and Farmers and Ranchers in Action has their Decade of Ag Pledge, and that's committed to utilizing agriculture as part of a climate solution and understanding that agriculture can and needs to be a part of the climate solution. We're also seeing the North American Meat Institute, or NAMI. They've created a very influential guidelines and commitments around their protein pact. And we're also seeing collaborative climate action partnerships and funding opportunities come from groups like Ag Mission. Ag Mission is a collaboration between the Foundation for Food and Agriculture Research, the U.S. Farmers and Ranchers in Action, and the World Farmers Organization, and has recently announced pending members and founding members that are Pepsi, McDonald's, and the Nature Conservancy as founding members. And I think what's interesting there is that that group is going to be aggregating their resources in their interests and their aligned goals to go out and utilize agriculture as part of a climate solution. Finally, we're seeing a meteoric rise in the carbon markets. It seems like, and I'm sure like everybody feels the same way, it seems like there's a new entrance into the carbon market every month. I previously worked with the Ecosystem Service Market Consortium, and I feel that carbon markets could help incentivize the change to more climate positive, climate smart agricultural production. I had another stat that I wanted to share with you as well, and this one's also pretty striking. Global demand for carbon credits is projected to increase 15-fold from 2020 levels and to be worth upwards of $50 billion by 2030. And that's a pretty incredible increase, 15-fold from 2020 to 2030. And that's according to the Task Force on Scaling Voluntary Carbon Markets, TSVCM, and that's a newer report. We're also seeing protein companies come out and make some pretty ambitious statements, goals, and programs. We're seeing investments from major packers and processors. Both Tyson and Cargill have SBTI climate goals, and they're working to implement programs to help them achieve them. And I think this is a great quote. Previously, I worked with Cargill and their Beef Up program, but through their proprietary customer insight research, they identified that climate change is the #1 concern for U.S. and beef consumers. And that's significant because I think a lot of the data that we had seen over the course of the last couple of years typically focus around animal health and welfare. So I have to touch on regenerative agriculture, and we're seeing a lot of programs and solutions being funded, and I don't have the time to discuss all of them today, but renewable energy and methane digesters are getting a lot of attention, but nothing seems to be as hot a topic as regenerative agriculture. And here are 3 projects that focus on regenerative grazing and row crop production, and they also happen to be a part of that Cargill Beef Up program that I just mentioned a little bit earlier. I was involved in these bottom 2, the funding and management of these launching of these bottom 2 regenerative ag programs. And what I wanted to highlight for the group here is these are multi-million-dollar investments, and companies are looking at these as more than a way to just reduce carbon. They understand that as farmers and ranchers utilize specific growing practices and build their soil carbon, they become more resilient to a warming climate. And that in turn makes their supply chains more resilient. So I can speak from my past experience. Companies are already feeling the pressure that climate change puts on their sourcing goals and their supply chain, especially in a supply chain that's becoming more constrained just due to the natural issues that we're dealing with currently. So finally, I'd like to share with you where my current work is focused, which is on the role that genetic improvements play in a sustainable food system. From my previous work, creating and implementing protein-specific greenhouse gas reduction strategies, I don't think we as sustainability professionals have completely understood or valued the role that genetic improvements play in helping us meet our public sustainability goals. And I think a great example is one of my own, and as I've gone back and reflected. In my case, I looked at a protein category like pork or chicken and would see how significant grain was to the emissions factor. So logically, I simply focused on funding sustainable grain programs. But genetic improvements provide the ability for animals to be healthier and more efficient before the grain is even fed. And to take it a step even further, we now have newer genetic improvement technologies like gene editing that can help us solve problems before they even exist. At PIC, we're working on a pig that is resistant to the PRRS virus. PRRS is a globally devastating disease. It causes animal suffering and costs approximately $2.5 billion a year in just the US and EU alone. So the benefits of such a technology are holistic and provide value across the supply chain, including improvements to animal welfare and reducing greenhouse gas emissions. Now, this certainly isn't to say that regenerative agriculture and all the other innovative interventions that so many of us are working on and investing in aren't important. They all are important, and they're all going to play a role in helping the industry and the world address climate change, utilizing agriculture. So just to close, it's been great connecting with you all again. I've been enjoying learning more about the role that genetics play in a sustainable food system and the opportunities that exist there. And so I look forward to sharing more of that work and my thoughts around that and working with all of you in the future. So this is my new updated contact information, and please feel to reach out if you'd like to connect or would be interested in collaborating or just to discuss and meet each other. So just thank you for your time, and I believe I'm going to pass it over to my friend Dallas Hockman.
Today, I'm going to focus on what I refer to as engaging with the marketplace. Again, my name is Dallas Hockman. I'm the Vice President of Industry Relations for the National Pork Producers Council. I'm very passionate about this subject because this is what I do every day as far as outreach efforts related to the key commitment of, in this case, of the pork industry to social responsibility. And so I thought it'd be good just for make sure everybody understands for us, we are a trade organization that represents America's pork producers. Historically, we've spent a significant amount of our time fighting against what we consider to be undue regulation or legislation and opening up new markets. But more and more of the time is now spent in regards to what I would call challenges in the marketplace. And the marketplace, in our case, what I wanted to focus on is these key 3 audiences. While we recognize and oftentimes talk about consumers, our feeling is that these categories here are playing a bigger and bigger role of influencing the consumer marketplace. Brands in this case are, as we might know it, are what we refer to as CPGs or consumer product goods companies that are the major brands. The channels are the way in which that product gets to the consumers, such as retail, food service, distributors, so forth. And then obviously policymakers. All of these are critically important. It's often referred to that less than 2% of the population are engaged in agriculture today in producing food. Well, guess what? Those individuals, they grow up and ultimately become decision makers in many of these different categories. And as a net result of this, they don't have a good understanding of where their food comes from. I often use a saying that says, we've done a great job of raising our product, but a poor job of raising our voice and talking to our key influencers in this case about how it is that we go about producing a product and the overall commitment that we have, also having shared values in doing what's right. As we all know, this past couple of years has been a significant challenge to the supply chain. For our industry specifically, the COVID factor hit us extremely hard. We saw a significant reduction in our packing plant capacity, difficult challenges having to be made by producers, relative speaking of where they go with their animals, the threat of African swine fever, and then ultimately the impact in the food chain was, for the first time, at least in my lifetime, was a significant supply chain constraint, availability of products. Many of the consumers for the first time in their life were faced with the challenge of going to the grocery store and not being able to buy product. In fact, there was rationing, as that you could see here. While that's greatly recovered today, we're still facing a significant supply chain issue, relative speaking to some of the highest priced protein categories we've seen in a long period of time, and not due to the traditional methodology that may have come out in the past of the roller coaster effort of commodities. But this is just the overall challenge of the supply chain, much of which is increased because of labor issues. But I see it all as a great opportunity because our customers now have the true understanding of the fragile supply chain in which we operate. And as a net result of that, as we see higher priced protein categories, as well as availability, it provides a great opportunity for us to be in there talking with them, relative speaking to all of the steps that are necessary to assure a safe, abundant food supply going forward. I'm going to focus a little bit of my time today on kind of leading up to one of the questions Hannah asked on the very front of what are some of the challenges associated with pressure being applied to our channel partners. And if we look back in history with our corporate entities, the real issue or purpose was driving was on next quarter's earnings, shareholder return. And then we began to see pressure coming out early on in the 90s and 2010s, especially for our industry, of activist pressure on sourcing policies. We only have to look back to the fact of, whether it be on antibiotics that were pressured, in the case here, for an example of Subway, or where McDonald's was the first major company because of pressure being applied by the Humane Society of putting into place restrictions on specific production practices. From there, we moved into the 2010 areas of companies beginning to publish holistic comments. This is as we saw the movements of companies beginning to transition and talking about their overall commitment for producing a better life and how they can help their consumers in that. As we moved into later in the 2019, 2020, we begin to see also pressure being applied by Roundtable, in this case, moving into the what I would call risk management category, and the fact that we need to have more than just profit focus. And today, as we see, as already referenced by Banks earlier, that ESG reporting becoming a part of doing business. And this is where we begin to see now benchmarking, whether it be the FAIR Initiative or others that are now rating companies based on this whole effort of what they're doing to assure, whether it be on animal welfare, whether it be on environment, whether it be on sustainability. So The point being is there has been an overall evolution that the companies have had to deal with, as well as not only pressure being applied from the activist groups, but just overall in general. And so as we move into this, I think it's really important for all of us to say, this is very much a commitment that we have to deal with today. We have a long history of talking about things that we're against. And I guess my only point in this is we have to do a better job of talking about shared values and what we're for. We have to be more proactive, what that is of minimizing the risk of negative influences that are taking place, whether those be internal and assurance that we're doing the things we say we're doing, but most importantly, increasing trust and confidence in what we do and how we do it. And I oftentimes use a very simple formula of what I call principles, practices, proof generates trust. You first have to do things because it's the right thing to do. We have a set of ethical principles we operate off of and compare all of our business operations to that. But we also have to have a unified set of practices because customers today want to have a uniform effort. They're not necessarily looking for one supplier to be uniquely different from the others. They would like to have an assurance from practices that are being applied, whether it's sustainability or whether it's an animal welfare. That's led us to have a unified effort, for example, of adopting our pork quality assurance program throughout and all of our packer and processors, supporting that, requiring that as part of market access, all the way through to our common swine industry audit, then ultimately moving into our sustainability efforts today with, as Banks alluded to earlier, and the metrics associated with them. But you also have to have proof. While it's a good story, we have to be sharing what it is that we're doing and the metrics and the progress that we're making on this continuous kind of effort that we have been going on for a number of years. So we have a commitment in our case of what I would call no more surprises. The point being is, oftentimes in the agriculture secretary, I joke, but we define proactive as reacting faster. Oftentimes when an issue comes about, we're in there then talking to our suppliers and customers about it, but we have to be more aggressive in sitting down with them and talking about our commitment, things that we're doing, opening up our barn doors, inviting our customers in to see what it is that we do, how we do it. And crisis management is one thing, which we're all of our industries have had to deal with that. But I would say that crisis preparation is more important. That is, it's much better to have someone in talking about our commitment prior to the obvious need to do that. And so we've embarked on an aggressive campaign over the past years of inviting our customers into the farms, whether in this case, for an example, whether it's a set of bloggers or sustainability officers or our retail and food service operators. Banks himself and his company has had numerous visits out to farms and looking at our farming operations, seeing firsthand what our producers do. And in the past, there has been some resistance to that. I would say the pork industry has recognized the need and the opportunity, even to the extent today, most of our producers oftentimes are now building facilities specifically oriented so that they can have customer tours and having their suppliers and operators such as McDonald's to come in and see the operations firsthand at what's going on. We can't be afraid of talking about what it is that we do, how we do it, and it's much better to do that firsthand than it is as again, we have a whole area. My department is solely focused on this. Animal Ag Alliance with Hannah has done a phenomenal job of continuing to support these through webinars and talking about these efforts and trying to get people on the farm. One effort that we're involved in and we have done since the past, I guess we've 10 years now, is somewhat different, is what we consider to be our shareholder outreach. In this case, 10 years ago, we approved for purchasing stock in companies. to go out and be able to be there at the shareholder meetings and counter any misinformation that's being presented to the companies, but more importantly, to continue to help in developing communication channels, present information, and most importantly, get introduced to the company leadership and other shareholders, there to engage with them on what it is that we're doing. We currently have investments in nearly 50 organizations in food service management, retail, distributors, financial sectors, and attend all of those shareholder meetings, most of the time with a very positive message of our appreciation of their efforts in supporting the pork industry, but at the same time, when and where necessary, delivering the message. As Banks talked about earlier today, more than ever, this sustainability efforts is a great opportunity for us. And so there, in this case, whether it be related to greenhouse gas emissions or soil health or whatever, it's a great opportunity to engage those, especially in the financial sector is an area of focus. We have to recognize for these companies, it's no simple solution. They're being challenged on a variety of different fronts. On one side, animal welfare issues, the other, sustainability and what's being done. At the same time, trying to balance the effort of the supply chain management and the impact that these have. And then ultimately dealing with the overall brand reputation in the marketplace and as well with their shareholders. And so our job is to make sure they understand what our, in this case, the pork industry's commitment is on all of these components. And here in the last 18 months, it's been very critical to make sure that we help them to better understand these decisions that possibly be made, what impact that's going to have on the supply chain. So it's a great opportunity at this to kind of encompass all of those together, while at the same time having an appreciation for those. For us, as I said earlier, I see this as a great opportunity for us to be talking about these, because we're at this intersection, as you heard from earlier from Karen, as well as Banks, that this kind of intersection of this technology, but at the same time, a focus on sustainability. And I think that's the great challenge that we have today, of making sure our customers understand that we are committed to the overall sustainability, but we can't do this without having a holistic approach. And so we have to talk about the technologies that are available today and what it would do to overall help them achieve their financial goals. I think also, as Banks talked about, it's a great opportunity for us in this new world, of this wild, wild west of this carbon credit, of talking about what's taking place within the industry. But in order to do that, we have to make sure that we have the capability to have metrics and measurement and being able to have a proof mechanism to deliver on those efforts. We have a program that we've had in place now for over 10 years of our, what would be considered to be our overall social responsibility initiative, and now has moved into the realm of sustainability, where we focus in each of these key areas in the holistic side of the equation, because we can't just singularly focus on one effort without reminding people of the potential impacts that it has on the other. But it provides a great opportunity in this case to look at each of these individually and address what it is that our industries are doing forward. One of the efforts for us is, from a resource allocation, is realizing where do people go for information relative to this information stuff. And so we put together a website specifically oriented towards our customers, in this case, the marketplace, our channel partners, where is solely devoted to telling our story, relative speaking to all the things that we're doing. So we don't have to go to some website and wade through a whole set of other issues relative to things that are going on within our industry. This site is specifically dedicated to solely delivering on the messages that they may have in regarding sustainability, animal welfare, or any of the other key priorities. So it's served as a great resource for those who have questions that after our visit, and they may want to go back and get more information. So we're constantly updating that. So I'd encourage anyone to go to this. This is a great program that the National Pork Board is continuing to work, and you're going to see a lot more efforts of that as we move forward in this year with delivering on our We Care metrics within the sustainability side of the equation. So we're very excited about that. So with that, I know we're challenged with the time limit. There's lots of other things that we could address, but I'm more interested in opening it up to the panel for questions that you may have relating to this. And so, Hannah, I will turn it back to you.
Wonderful. Well, thank you so much, Karen, Banks, and Dallas, for providing those remarks. We will jump into our Q&A. So I'd like to invite all three of our panelists to join me back on the virtual stage. As anticipated, the Q&A box is popping, so we have lots of things to get to, and we'll get to as many as we can with the roughly half an hour we have left in today's session. We'll start with Karen, as animal welfare is obviously part of your expertise and part of what you shared with us. We have a question about whether the term welfare has been tested lately to see if shoppers or consumers understand what that really means. Because welfare to different people might have a different definition. So how do we understand what consumers actually know about animal welfare and how that aligns with the science?
You know, Hannah, I saw that question in the chat box, and I actually made a note about that because I think that that is really a fantastic question that we probably need to pursue. You know, I work almost exclusively in the area of animal welfare. So for me, the answer is really obvious. But when somebody sparks that question about what does that mean to the other people, outside people, consumers, customers, I think that that's a great opportunity for us to explore that and make sure that we understand that as we're developing and delivering the messages and the great messages that we have to share. So I would like to thank whoever submitted that question, and we will definitely take a hard look at that. Thank you.
What I've heard you say before, Karen, too, like we have to ask the chickens what welfare means and what humane means, because our vision, and maybe if you're a consumer, what you think of as your dog or cat isn't necessarily what a chicken wants. So it's not only what our definitions are, but it's what is actually best for the livestock and poultry. And maybe those aren't always the same.
You know, I think that's absolutely true. And I think we're seeing that in some of the initiatives that are being pushed. And that's why we're focusing so hard on answering these important questions by including the animals in the conversation. And as you know, and maybe some other folks have heard us talk about the work we're doing with lighting, chickens don't see the world the same. So I think it's really important that we view the world from their perspective when we're making those important decisions for them. And in this case, I think that applies very well to the question, what does welfare mean to the consumer? We not only need to understand that, but we probably also need to help shape that so that they can understand that we're focused on doing the right thing for the animals in the way the animals would want it done. And that, you know, we care enough to take the opportunity to do that. So really an important clarification and way that we need to guide the great story that we all have to tell across all the different industries that have had the opportunity to visit today.
Excellent, thank you. I'll direct the next question to Banks, and I think you might have paid our attendee to put this in the Q&A box and have the opportunity to talk about it, because from what I understand, this is going to be your new role. So the question is, the attendee is a veterinarian who works for a large swine production company, so she is totally on board with the PRRS-resistant pigs, but do you think the general public will accept the science and this technology?
Yeah, that's a great question, Hannah, and thank you just for submitting it. And I guess to answer the question abruptly, yes, I do believe that the customer will accept it. And I think that they're going to have to. I think when we look at the benefits that, especially in gene editing on a PRRS virus pig, the benefit that provides up and down the value chain, it's so significant that we can't not utilize it. There's a benefit to the pig, there's a benefit to the environment, there's a benefit for the farmer, there's a benefit up and down. And so we start looking at protein availability, we start looking at the general more acceptance of consumers around technology and biotechnology and human health. We're starting to see gene edited humans You probably have seen a lot of interesting things that are moving in that space. It seems like almost every week we've got some new examples there. And so I think that all of that is going to lead up to just more of a conversation around what gene editing is and what it can do, and what responsible gene editing is going to deliver up and down the value chain. So of course I am biased, but I'm very confident the consumer will accept it.
I think it goes along with the point that Dallas made too about trying to be proactive and be the first one to talk about it and the one to set the tone and set the conversation versus maybe waiting and being reactive when the conversation's already out there. So I think there's a lot of power in also trying to be out there and be on the forefront and have these conversations proactively.
Completely agree.
Well, Dallas, I'll direct this next one to you. And I warned you that I was sure legislation was going to come up, and it has. So what is the education plan currently, or maybe moving forward, to help legislators understand the complexities of animal welfare? Because restaurant retail is obviously one thing in the policies they're making, but there's also legislation being created around farm practices that really creates an urgent need for fostering understanding. So how are you at NPPC taking that on, and how can the broader animal ag community also get involved?
Yeah, sure. Well, the great thing about policy is there's a very regimatic process in which things occur. And so most all of the species groups have trade organizations that represent them. And we have staff that we have on the Hill that's talking to the ag committees, that's talking to the individual members. But most importantly, it gets back to the raising our voice, that it starts at home. It starts with producers getting involved. It starts with talking to them locally. Obviously, we're more and more of our legislators and that are coming from an urban environment. So the same process occurs. We have to have engagement, not only where they work, in this case at the state capitol or in DC, but as well when they're back home. And so that's why, for example, we just had our legislative fly-in where we bring producers in and we talk about the issues at hand of what's there and helping them better understand the impacts of these. And again, the situation as we're dealing with right now with inflation is the topic that the administration and everybody's talking about. Well, that fits well into talking about the ramifications of these subjects. So you can't just be against a bill or whatever, and you have to be in support of something. So that means supporting your efforts, that's the great thing about associations. What can we do together? We can't do alone, but at the same time, you have to be involved. So you have to be engaged in it, understand, where the industry's at, what our commitments are, and then making sure that we're reaching out and touching those elected officials about the impact that it's going to have on rural America, the impact it's going to have on family farms, what it is. And people just have to tell their story because that's what they really want to hear is from their elected, officials.
Karen, another animal welfare focused question. For many years, the person that this attendee has heard the most about when it comes to animal welfare is Temple Grandin. So are there other individuals out there, mainly maybe on social media or other influencers or influential voices who are talking about animal welfare in a knowledgeable and science-based way that we should be listening to and helping to elevate? Besides yourself, of course.
Oh, that's a great question. And, I think we all really, you talk about taking advantage of power in the message and being first. And I think that Temple Grandin's been a great, done great work in the space of welfare, bringing it to everybody's attention, and certainly somebody that everybody relates to in terms of the voice of animal welfare. We're starting to see a lot of great voices with a lot of great work done with welfare now. Most all of the universities that have efforts in some type of animal production or animal science, now have people on staff that are focused on animal welfare. So I think the good news is there isn't just one voice anymore, but there are lots of voices that are working in academia, in the production companies, working in allied industries, and we're all driving that message about how important it is to, in a meaningful way, drive continuous improvement in animal welfare.
And as a shameless plug, the Alliance does have a third-party expert list of a lot of those folks that Karen mentioned at universities that are definitely really valuable resources in this. So that's available via request. And that's one of the most popular resources, thanks to Dallas for giving a shout out to our food chain engagement work. That's one of the things a lot of the brands ask us for is, well, who can we go to? Who can we add to our advisory councils? Who are the experts? So we do have that third-party expert list if anyone wants to request it. And that's something that brands ask us for quite a bit as well, because they also want to make sure they're hearing from the most informed voices. So great to find those folks and amplify them. Banks, you talked quite a bit about the climate narrative and the challenge that that's posing to companies. So this attendee is wondering, do people really know what a greenhouse gas is? And how do we broaden the conversation around sustainability and climate to be more inclusive of the bigger picture?
Yeah, it's a great question. I think it kind of ties well into the customers understand what welfare is. And I think by and large, I think that it probably gets obfuscated by a lot of the conversation, and it probably gets mischaracterized sometimes. But I think that generally speaking, the consumer understands that when we talk about GHG emissions, we're talking about climate change. And I think that it doesn't take very long for a consumer to be able to point to something within their life that's been impacted by climate change one way or another. Let it be stronger storms or weather patterns or the inability to source a certain type of product at a time of year. And so, although some of the specifics, not even, none of us can understand all of the scientific understanding of GHG emissions and the complicated accounting process that comes underneath it. But I think generally speaking, most people understand that climate change is an issue. They can point to ways that it's impacting them. And so I guess my answer would be, we probably need to continue talking more about what the GHG emissions factors are doing, but being able to then also tie it to a simpler message of how it addresses climate change and how it addresses the ways that really impact a consumer.
Yeah, I think that what's in it for me is always the question. So making it relatable to people and understanding what the bottom line will be for them really makes it resonate and more memorable. So Dallas, you mentioned some pork producers were building facilities that were more oriented to transparency and showing people the farm. Can you talk a little bit more about that? Give us an example, and how is that different than maybe a conventional facility?
Well, obviously, oftentimes when we have customers, for example, I have McDonald's coming out next week, for example, you have a large group. I mean, you have 7, 8 people in regards to that. Oftentimes their supplier as well might want to come in. So everyone is there together in the chain. So you have the producer, the packer processor, and the end user, in this case, for example, of a McDonald's. So you might have 10 people. And so that's a very difficult situation to get that many people through a facility. And so a lot more producers are building facilities, that's really equipped. So they're putting additional showers in for shower in and shower out so that they can get people through in an orderly fashion and then getting them into the facilities that's there. But most importantly, it's taking that opportunity for engaging with them, of showing them firsthand, don't be afraid, to invite them in and show them what's being done, talk about their commitment, and do it firsthand. Oftentimes it's very important to have the owner operator there, their veterinarian there, so they can answer the questions, relatively speaking, whether it be, on nutrition, health, animal welfare. And also take them, we're really encompassing this now in a much broader sense, because for us, utilization of swine manure is a huge asset because of now is a huge demand, the opportunity for this nutrient life cycle regenerative that Banks talked about. So we want them, there, showing them how we're using that in the holistic cycle of helping soil health, reducing our use of the need for additional fertilizer and so forth. So that's kind of the reason, mainly because we have more of an interest of customers wanting to come and see. We started off this, if you'll remember, Hannah, unfortunately, 10, 15 years ago, because of undercover videos. All of a sudden, okay, there was an undercover video and someone wanted to come and see. What that meant was that's code for we wanted to check and see. Well, now it's much more progressed. Don't wait till an issue comes. Invite them in. And so that they see firsthand how things are done, so they can speak firsthand when someone speaks out against it within their team that says, well, I've heard this. Well, they can say, well, that's really not the case. I was there, I saw this. And whether it's poultry or whether it's beef or pork, it really doesn't matter. It's just firsthand seeing what is taking place, sharing with them the information. But it takes a lot of work. Hannah, you will remember, we were involved with Animal Ag Alliance in the very first blogger tour where we were bringing bloggers out. And, producers were like, for the life of me, I don't even know what these guys do or exist. What are they going to write about? And our point being is we don't really care as long as it's a very positive deal. But it is a risk because, producers oftentimes use biosecurity as a defense mechanism. Well, we don't want to invite anybody. Well, we have to be very conscious. And that story of biosecurity is great. And it's a great story to talk about. But in general, these individuals are at a very low risk of that. And we take the steps to assure, them that.
Well, I think the key part of your answer to that question is it's not the production practices that are any different on these maybe showcase farms. It's just the way they're, like you said, they're set up with showers and maybe a viewing area and a cafeteria to host meals during meetings. It's not that you're changing the way the production is done for the sake of people coming to visit. It's just the way they come to look at it, which is something that always, when I've been on some of the farm tours that you mentioned, sometimes the attendees will say, well, you took us here because this is such a great farm. The rest of the farms aren't like this. So it's always valuable to explain, well, actually, no, this is the way it's done across most farms of this size. And here's why. And, this is just one family we're introducing you to, but there's thousands more that are just like them. So definitely seeing it firsthand, and we call it the Alliance Radical Transparency. So we've got to show it, we've got to talk about it, and we can answer any questions and concerns that arise, but we've got to be transparent about the way we're raising animals today. Karen, another question specifically about something you mentioned. You talked about key welfare indicators for poultry. Is there similar work on key welfare indicators in other sectors? Because that could help consumers sort out different programs if they have similar indicators across species.
Yeah, that's a good question. The poultry industry of all the species, I think, is really putting a lot of effort in identifying, explaining, and then sharing out what these important key welfare indicators are. And again, the whole purpose of that is to provide metrics that people can monitor and then manage. And that's a great story for driving continuous improvement. But I think it also provides a great source of information for customers to help them have confidence that, again, that the animals in the supply chain had a good life. So I'm really focused on the work that's being done on the poultry side. And I think I would ask Dallas if you have any thoughts or information about similar work that's being done on the hog side. And if not, I would certainly encourage all of the species to start this effort, because I think it's one that's really going to help drive our story in a meaningful way to customers and consumers.
Yes, Karen, I couldn't agree more. I think up until this point, much of our discussion, for example, around animal welfare is what we're against. They want us to stop doing X. Mm-hmm. And then it's oftentimes phrased in some type of consumer message that actually resonates. But they use the quote, halo effect of animal welfare. Well, at some point, we have to begin to define those metrics within the animal welfare. Okay, what are those key factors that we are using? In our case, whether it be things like lameness scores, body condition scoring, all of those, because it's important at some point in this new world of metrics, especially as sustainability has come into play and we're talking about greenhouse gas emissions or whatever it may be of how we go about measuring that. I think the new dialogue is really important to say, all right, let's really define these changes that were made, whatever they might be. Have they resulted in truly enhanced animal welfare. And that is a discussion that's really not been had like it should. And so we are beginning to look at things, and research, for example, on social behavior, for example, of animals, in this case, sows, for example, when you move them if you move them into a group setting, there's offsetting things that happen. For example, all of a sudden you might have an increase in lesion scoring or scratching because the animals are fighting because of a natural behavior of going through a heat cycle. But I couldn't agree more that we begin to look at those variables that help to define what a measurement of animal welfare is, so that we can kind of begin to track those. So as we make behavioral changes or modifications to environment or facilities or that, are we ultimately at the end of the day improving the animal welfare? Because otherwise it just becomes a subjective measure of a debate of what's good for the animal and what's not. And I'm encouraged by some of the work that's being done now. And the National Pork Board is involved in this same process of enticing research on this at land-grant universities, because otherwise the debate is always what we're against versus what we're for. And so we're all for improved, enhanced animal welfare that ultimately lends itself to better productivity. But in this new filter, we recognize it has to be science-based, but we have to look at it in the court of public opinion. But we also have to have good data behind it to show that indeed these, whatever it is that truly are benefiting the animal. So I couldn't agree with you more, Karen.
Well, and I think that it's a really great way also to demonstrate, first of all, that many of the things that maybe the NGOs like to accuse us of, we have the data to show that in fact, the picture may be very different, that the animals through these key welfare indicator scores, do have a good life. And it also gives us the opportunity to react very quickly if we see, even on an individual facility where those key metrics start to drift a little bit. So I think that it's really a great way to demonstrate, like you said, that there can be flexibility and differences in management styles and practices. And but at the end of the day, if we've identified the right metrics, we can show that there is definitely more than one path to providing these animals with a good life.
Yeah, I think a lot of the focus needs to be, as I've heard you talk about before, Karen, it's about outcomes. So, what is the end outcome of this? And similar to what you mentioned, Dallas, it's not necessarily how we get there and being overly prescriptive about how we get there, but how do we ensure we're actually doing something that has a positive outcome? And I think I would also add to the great discussion you guys just had that there are animal ag community animal welfare programs across all sectors. So pork has We Care, beef has quality assurance, dairy has the farm program. So there are programs in place that are establishing guidelines and best practices for animal welfare. And that's another message that really resonates with that restaurant retail audience when we tell them, did you know that you could slap on your website tomorrow that the farm program, 99% of milk is coming from farms that are part of the farm program, and be done with, dairy animal welfare. That's your statement. It's, you can be done with that. And their eyes just light up realizing, oh, hey, wait a minute, maybe we don't have to do this. Maybe there are existing programs that we can just endorse and support. So I think that's a good message to get out there as well, that there are programs looking at this and establishing best practices and guidelines in this area. Speaking of that, a lot of those conversations do tend to go along with discussions of new marketing schemes that restaurant or retail brands want to adopt, or a new label. So there's a question here in the Q&A box that I'll direct to you, Banks, as kind of the most recent person to be representing one of these household name brands, I guess in addition to Tyson, but from the restaurant space. So this question is specifically about on-pack labels, but I think this can apply to kind of animal welfare policies strategies and marketing schemes as well, that they can kind of become a weapon used as a competitive tool and not necessarily meant to educate. So how can the animal ag community do something about that and maybe help the restaurant retail community as they're looking for ways to compete? And again, make sure that it's providing education to shoppers and not setting up animal welfare or sustainability as the next competitive issue.
Yeah, it's an interesting one, and I saw the second part of that question too, which is carbon neutrality going to be kind of the next big one? And I think that it is going to be, and we're already starting to see that. Marfrig, the Brazilian beef company, owns a portion of National. They actually own a carbon neutral beef program that's in Brazil. It's already branded. We're seeing programs in the United States that are getting USDA process verified program approval to make climate commitments. And so I think that we're going to start seeing a lot of commitments around carbon and around food. In the space that I came from, I mean, Panera Bread actually came out and they're saying that they're going to start putting, I think they call it their cool food score, that actually talks about GHG emissions associated with the purchase of each meal. Procter & Gamble made a similar type of commitment on a lot of their packaged goods, where they're going to start putting the GHG emissions right there on the package. And so I think that the GHG part and the climate change angle of selling products, especially in protein, because it gets so much attention, there's going to be a lot more there. I think the problem is that when we do get so many different labels and they just start competing with each other, and you start going to the store and you look at it and there's 7 or 8 different labels on a chicken, and it's hard to understand what's better. And I think a lot of times the consumer goes in and says, oh, well, if I can afford it and this has 7 different labels, maybe this one's better. And so, you know, I think that's one that we may have to let the market play out. But whenever we do allow somebody to have a label, making sure that it's credible. You know, sometimes we see things labeled, especially in chicken, where the practice isn't allowed. On industry standard, it'd be illegal to utilize a hormone in chicken to begin with. And so I think some things like that can be hard for a customer to understand because they're trying to do the right thing. And I get that question from my family, and my little sister just the other day called and said, hey, like, I'm purchasing this. Like, what does this label mean? Does this mean that I should pay an extra, I forget what it was. You know, there's some type of premium. And so as long as customers continue to have interest there, I think that there's going to be people that try to capitalize on it. But I think we need, as an industry, to reaffirm that just because there's labels that differentiate does not mean that the conventional supply is not operating at a very high level. And I think that sometimes gets to be the point where we have to demonize the majority of production so that we can sell a niche at a very unique premium. And that shouldn't be the case, because we should be proud of American producers, and we're getting better. These type of commitments are getting us better. But is it much different than some of the things that are asking? I don't know.
Yeah, absolutely. I think that's a great point, that we can compete and go after these niche markets, but we have to do it in a way that, again, doesn't imply that the product without a ton of labels is somehow unsafe or unethically produced. We want our consumers to know that whatever they're choosing, whatever aligns with their values and their budgets, they can feel confident in that. And if they want to pay a premium for grass-fed or organic or cage-free, whatever that might be, that's all well and good. But that doesn't mean that it's a value judgment on the other product. Is a great conversation to have. Well, we are coming up on our time here. I do want to toss this question out. I'm not going to put anyone specifically on the spot, but if any of you have a theory. So obviously there's been a lot of conversation online about the recent acquisition of Twitter by Elon Musk and what that might mean for algorithms and messaging. So this questioner would like to know if any of you see a potential change in the media and a switch in the volume of conversation when it comes to meat versus alternative proteins. So anyone have a theory on that? Yeah, I think if any of us were fortune tellers, we would probably be able to hazard a guess. But it's definitely an interesting question. And I would encourage you, during the actual summit itself, we will have Steve Lurch, a former Google executive, who's going to be leading us through an interactive workshop. And I would encourage you to ask that question to Steve. I think he's probably the right person who can explain all of those algorithms and what changes might come as a result of change in ownership. So I wanted to get to that question because I thought it was interesting, but I don't have an answer. So I'm sure our panelists don't either. But I encourage you to come back and ask Steve Lurch again that question during Summit because he might be able to shed some light on it. So with our last few minutes here, I want to give each of you an opportunity to kind of sum things up and let us know your action items for the group. And Dallas, we'll start with you because I want to specifically ask you to respond to the last question in the Q&A box here, but I thought it was a good wrap-up question, which is how can the livestock sectors, beef, pork, dairy, chicken, turkey, egg, all those folks work more collaboratively, which is of course needed because animal protein tends to be seen as one single entity. So I'll let you respond to that. And then if you have any other final thoughts and action items that you want to leave our audience with today.
Well, obviously, farmers, ranchers are a very independent group. And oftentimes, as a net result, we replicate a lot of efforts. I would just say, first and foremost, we have right in front of us with Animal Ag Alliance is a great group to be a part of, to carry those messages. I mean, because customers, when you talk to them about these issues, yes, we're there talking about pork, but they have the same concerns or issues about poultry and beef and dairy. And so, as an example, with the recent webinars that we're having, that's there, or when we're having meetings with groups, or the summit, it's a great opportunity to come together and tell the story. All right. And so that's one asset. The next one is with Banks referred to it, with NAMI, with the protein pack, is Animal Alliance is a part of that. We're part of it. It's a great opportunity there to focus, in this, especially about the key issues related to nutrition and environment and things that are there. And most importantly, how can we do a better job of talking about protein in general? So, I mean, those are two things that I say that they're already in the works and are operation. We don't need a lot more new groups. We need to really put some power behind the groups that exist today that's already there. And they're growing in popularity. But what I would say is also you just have to be engaged. I mean, you have to be willing to wade into the fire and go and visit with companies and talk about these issues. You cannot wait around in the assumption that what we're doing is right. And I hate the word educate because no one wants to be educated. What you want to have is a dialogue with these individuals. You want to be able to go in and talk to them about this and then develop relationships over time. Trust comes from relationships. And so I would say the need of the opportunity to be in, sitting down across the table, visiting with these, and more importantly, when questions come, when news stories come, and when a bad press piece comes, who do they call about information? And you have to be willing to provide that to them in a very transparent way. But you can't start with the premise of go in there and educate these stupid people because they, as I said earlier, they have a significant amount of pressure being applied to them all up and down the chain on all those different categories. And as Banks said, as they're going to try to meet more and more of these obligations, they're going to have to rely upon the supply chain to deliver it. They can only do so much within their four walls and their manufacturing and process. But most importantly, I would say, A, learn from others, don't reinvent the wheel. Utilize, in this case, Animal Ag Alliance and the resource part of it. Encourage your association groups, if they're not a part of it, to be a part, to be there. And then begin to identify good stewards that you can use as spokespeople, whether it's at Food Marketing Institute or National Restaurant Association or the Fancy Food Show or whatever it is that you can go and talk and be firsthand in front of these people to be able to ask the questions.
Wonderful. And Karen, your final thoughts and action items for the audience.
Yeah, thanks, Hannah. I guess I start off by saying thank goodness for farmers. There's just so much going on right now, but at the end of the day, we all sit down and have an evening meal, and I think that we all need to remember, where that food comes from, and we're all focused on doing things better, but first of all, we should be really grateful that we have the food supply that we have. The world is going to continue to demand animal products, and so it's important that we're all engaged in being that bridge between the increase in demand and the supply that's going to be there, and how we can continue to drive continuous improvement in welfare and make sure that people understand through whatever means that those animals do live a good life. And Dallas and Banks and me and our team at Tyson, that's our sole focus, is how do we continue to drive continuous improvement so people can feel good about utilizing these products. And I think I want to echo Dallas's comments about the Animal Ag Alliance, because I think there's definitely strength in numbers, and this organization gives us the opportunity to work within species, between species, and up and down the supply chain. And I think that that's how we really do provide an opportunity to share the important information up and down that supply chain that really helps to unify all of us. And I think it's meetings like this that brings together speakers from different perspectives and an audience that can challenge and ask questions of all of us and engage in these conversations is really how we're going to make a difference.
Wonderful. And Banks, final thoughts and action items.
Great. Yeah, I know we're close on time, so I'll be brief. And I think Dallas and Dr. Christensen did a great job, but I think obviously what we're looking at is there's going to be a big change that's going to be happening in agriculture as all of these pressures mount, and we all try to work to utilize agriculture as a solution and to stay relevant and produce protein efficiently. And so I guess my big take home would be, let's make sure that we're looking at all of the interventions that we have at our disposal and our resources. And for me, I've been really, really excited to learn more about genetics and genetic improvement and the role that can and is already playing. And so that's going to be something that I'm going to be focusing on a lot and being able to share that message. And so my take home would be, as folks are looking at their strategies, making sure that they understand that there's a first step there. And as we're going to raise livestock, making sure that they're the correct genetic, that they're the right animal, that's able to be healthy and robust and efficient. That's going to play a significant role in allowing us to produce the proteins that we're all discussing here with all these different aspects of them. So yeah, I'll stop there, but thank you so much for having me today, Hannah.
Well, thank you so much to all three of our speakers this afternoon, Karen, Banks, and Dallas, for sharing those really valuable insights, as well as a very engaging question and answer session.